Chapter 15, Battle in California. The nasty weather that had assaulted Seattle since the previous October finally broke. On April 2nd, a warm sun blossomed over Lake Washington. Students emerged from the mustiness of the library and the dankness of their rented rooms. At the Shell House, the crew boys stripped off their jerseys and stretched out on the ramp, basking in the sun. Joe figured a day out on the water would be good for Joyce. Her hatred for the job at the judge's house was growing with each passing day. She needed a break, so they rented a canoe and Joe paddled them briskly across the Montlake Cut. He made his way lazily among the green expanse of lily pads and beaver lodges on the south side of Union Bay until he found a spot he liked. Then he let the boat drift. Joyce reclined in the bow, trailing a hand in the water, soaking up the sun. Joe stretched out as best he could in the stern and gazed up into the blue sky. From time to time, a frog croaked and plopped into the water. Blue dragonflies hovered overhead, their wings rattling dryly. After a while, Joe took his guitar out of its battered old case and began to sing. At first, he sang the songs he and Joyce had sung on the school bus back in Squim, funny, happy-go-lucky songs that made them both laugh. Then Joe slipped into soft, slow, sweet love songs, and Joyce grew quiet, watching him and listening, happy in a different, deeper way. When Joe stopped playing, they talked about what it would be like when they were married and had a home and maybe kids. They talked all afternoon with no sense of time passing, until the chill of evening finally sent them paddling back to the university side of the bay. It was a day that both of them would remember well into old age. The next day, Joe, still feeling good after his day with Joyce, bought a little gas and drove over to the bakery where his father worked as a mechanic. He rolled the window down and waited, trying to enjoy the smell of baking bread, but too nervous to really savor it. A little after noon, men dressed in white streamed out of the building and began sitting on the lawn opening lunch boxes. Then a few men in dark coveralls emerged. Joe spotted his father immediately. At 6'2", he was easily the tallest man in the group. Joe climbed out of the car and trotted across the street. Harry looked up, saw him coming, and froze in place. Clutching his lunchbox, Joe stuck out his hand and said, "Hi, Pop." Startled, Harry said nothing but took his son's hand. It had been 5.5 years since he'd seen Joe. He was no longer the scrawny kid he had left behind in Squim. Harry had to wonder what Joe was doing there. Had his son come to confront him or forgive him? "Hi, Joe," he said slowly. "It's swell to see you." The two of them crossed the street and climbed into the front of Joe's car. Harry unwrapped a salami sandwich and silently offered half of it to Joe. They began to eat, and then, after a long, awkward silence, to talk. Harry spoke about the machinery and equipment in the bakery, and Joe said little at first. He wasn't much interested in the machinery, but just happy to be hearing the sound of his father's big, deep, familiar voice. When Joe finally started to talk, questions about his half-siblings tumbled out. How was Harry Jr. doing? How big was Mike now? How were the girls getting on? Harry assured him they were all well. There was a long pause. Joe asked if he could come by and see them. Harry looked down in his lap and said, "I don't reckon so, Joe." Deep down in Joe's gut, something surged. Anger? Disappointment? Resentment? He couldn't quite place the emotion, but it was old and familiar and painful. But then, without looking up, Harry added, "Sometimes Thula and I go off on little excursions, though. Nobody home but the kids then." In early April, the Pacific Coast Regatta was approaching. This year, the Washington cruise would face California on its own waters. As the day of the race grew nearer, Joe and the boys could not seem to hold on to their magic. One day they'd have it, the next they'd lose it. They would beat the junior varsity on Monday, lose badly on Tuesday, win again on Wednesday, lose on Thursday. There was no clear favorite in the competition for the first boat, but Albrechtsen had to make a decision. Finally, he placed his faith in the sophomores and made them the 1935 first varsity crew. The local newspapers announced it to the world. The sophomores promptly lost their head-to-head race against the JV boat. Once again, Albrechtsen changed his mind. He declared that the two boats would race one more time on the Oakland estuary a few days before the regatta. The winning boat would row as the varsity. On April 10th, after the team traveled down to California, Albrechtsen staged the race. Joe and his sophomore crewmates came in almost a length behind the JV. The sophomores slumped in their shell in disbelief. The JV had won the right to row as varsity. Yet, Albrechtsen still hesitated. The sophomores had come south with a new shell, and they did not like it. They had been complaining since they arrived that it just didn't swing for them, so Albrechtsen sent them out again in their old shell, the city of Seattle. This time, they rode beautifully and matched the JV's time. After a team dinner at the Hotel Oakland that night, Albrechtsen dropped the bomb on the JV. He told them that he was going to race the sophomores as the varsity, despite their repeated defeats. "I'm sorry," he said. "I probably shouldn't do this, but I can't help it." The JV boys walked out of the room in a rage. When reporters asked Albrechtsen about the series of reversals, he said simply what he believed in his heart about the sophomores. They were, he declared, possibly the best crew I've ever coached. Race day, April 13th, was rainy, and a stiff headwind blew out of the south up the length of the Oakland estuary. The estuary was not a pretty place to row. Crumbling brick warehouses, oil storage tanks, rusting cranes, and gritty factories lined both sides of the waterway. The water itself was gray-green and oil-slicked. Right next to Cal's shell house, a 4-inch pipe discharged raw sewage directly into the estuary. By mid-afternoon, nearly 40,000 spectators had assembled. They gathered under umbrellas and empty lots, on scattered docks, on warehouse rooftops, and on small craft moored along the race course. At the finish line, on the Fruitvale Avenue Bridge, thousands of California fans in blue and gold mingled with hundreds of Washington loyalists in purple and gold. Everyone was jostling to get a good view of the water. The freshman race went off first, with Washington stroke Don Hume easily powering the boat to a 3-length victory over Cal. The JV raced next, and with Bobby Mock calling the cadence and Big Stub McMillan in the engine room, Washington dominated again, winning by a staggering 8 lengths. As Joe and the sophomores varsity paddled to their starting position, they figured they pretty much had to win now, after what the boys in the JV had just done. Once they started, Washington leapt out to an early lead. Cal raised its rate and pulled even, then moved out in front by half a length. Both boats settled in and held their positions for the next mile and a half. The blades of the two boats were dipping in and out of the water, almost stroke for stroke. At the halfway point, California slowly increased its rate and stretched its lead out to a full length. George Morey, the Washington coxswain, called for more. Ever so slowly, the boys began to claw their way back inch by inch. They whittled the lead down to a quarter of a length. Then they were bow to bow. Cal raised its stroke rate, but Washington remained steady and nosed out ahead. The boat surged into view of the fans at the finish line. Up on the bridge, California started to sprint, charging forward again, back into the lead. The Cal fans erupted in cheers, but George Morey did not panic. He resisted the temptation to call for a higher stroke rate, knowing his boys still had plenty of power. Then, as the bridge loomed ahead, he leaned forward and called out, "Give me 10 big ones." The Washington boys dug hard. The boat leapt forward. At the end of the 10 strokes, the bows of the boats were dead even again, with the bridge and the finish line closing on them. Morey screamed again, "Give me 10 more." Joe and Shorty and Roger and everyone with an oar in his hands threw everything they had into the last few pulls. The boat shot under the bridge, side by side. On the bridge, pandemonium broke out. Someone called out that Washington won by 2 feet. The Washington fans roared. The loudspeaker boomed out, "Looks like California won by 2 feet." The Cal fans roared. Radio announcers hesitated and then beamed the news out to the nation. "California wins!" The Washington fans on the bridge were furious, shouting and pointing angrily down at the water. Their boys had surged ahead at the end. Anyone could see that. The pandemonium increased. Then suddenly the loudspeaker crackled back to life. The judges announced officially that Washington won by 6 feet. A few days later, on April 18th, the city of Seattle held a parade for the victorious Washington crews. 80 members of the Washington Husky Marching Band led the procession up 2nd Avenue and Pike Street as confetti and scraps of paper mixed with a steady cold rain drifting down from clouds high above. Al Albrechtsen and Tom Bowles rode with the mayor in a flower-bedecked car. Then came the main attraction, a long logging truck draped in flowers and green foliage carrying the varsity crew in their shell. The boys wore white sweaters with big purple W's emblazoned on them. Each held a 12-foot-long oar upright. Joe knew Joyce was at work, so she scanned the faces in the crowd looking for his father or his half-siblings. They were nowhere to be seen. At the Washington Athletic Club, the boys were ushered into a smoky room packed with hundreds of Seattle's leading citizens. The boys from all 3 boats were called up onto a stage and introduced one at a time, each to a long, sustained applause. When it was Joe's turn, he stood for a moment looking out over the scene before him. White light poured into the room from tall windows, flanked by heavy velvet curtains. Enormous crystal chandeliers hung, shimmering from high ornated plastered ceilings. Wealthy men and women sat at the tables spread with gleaming silverware and platters heaped with hot food. Waiters in white coats and black bow ties scurried among the tables, carrying trays with still more food. As Joe raised a hand to acknowledge the wave of applause, he found himself struggling desperately to keep back tears. He had never let himself dream of standing in a place like this, surrounded by people like these. He felt a sudden surge of something familiar, a sense of pride that was deeper and more heartfelt than any he had ever felt before. Now it was on the national championships again. And then, the next year, maybe even Berlin. Everything finally seemed to be turning golden.
Chapter 16. Rage, Fear, and Uncertainty. On the first day of training for the Poughkeepsie Regatta, Albrechtsen surprised everyone by announcing that the sophomores weren't necessarily going to remain the first varsity boat. The boys in the junior varsity boat, he said, deserved a shot at a national varsity championship. Joe and the other sophomores couldn't believe it. They hadn't just beaten another crew on the estuary, they'd beaten the defending national champions. Furious, they decided to put the JV boys in their place as soon as they got out on the water. Instead, they did the opposite. Albrechtsen raced the two boats against each other again and again all through May. Occasionally the sophomores won, but usually they lost. They rowed well when left on their own, but months of taunting had gotten under their skin. Too often, the moment they got a glimpse of the older boys, they fell completely apart. Albrechtsen was furious. In April, he had crowed to the press that his all-sophomore crew was great, possibly the greatest crew I've ever coached, he said. Now they seemed bent on making a fool of him. At the end of May, after another impressive JV victory, Albrechtsen made another difficult decision. Washington had not won the varsity race at Poughkeepsie since 1926, when Albrechtsen himself was rowing stroke. He needed the victory, and the JV boat now seemed to offer the best chance. So Albrechtsen announced that barring some kind of miracle, the older boys would race as the varsity crew for the national championship. The trip to Poughkeepsie was not the boisterous and carefree jaunt of the year before. The weather was hot all the way across the country, the train stuffy and uncomfortable. The sophomores and the older boys tried to stay out of each other's way. Joe and Shorty Hunt and Roger Morris kept largely to themselves in one corner of a coach. There was no singing this time. Joe had left his guitar at home. After arriving in Poughkeepsie, the Washington Husky crews visited each of their rival shell houses. None of the others could believe the sophomores had been demoted. At each stop, Albrechtsen had to explain it all over again to his fellow coaches. Yes, indeed, despite what had happened in California, he planned to send the older boys off in the varsity race and enter the sophomores in the junior varsity race. The coaches were shocked. So was the press. Several Seattle sports writers had openly questioned whether he'd made the right decision. One writer pointed out that the sophomores always seemed to get stronger as the races went on, and the Poughkeepsie course would be a mile longer than the one in Oakland. By the time they got to rowing on the Hudson River, conditions were tough out on the water. It was rainy, and a cold, stiff wind was whipping downstream. The river was a heaving mass of rollers, the water dark and oily. The conditions were so bad that the Washington boats were the only ones out on the water. All the other crews were content to remain in the warmth of their shell houses. The Bears from California had the warmest and coziest spot of all, a brand spanking new boathouse complete with clean water, hot showers, a dining room, cooking facilities, electric lights, and spacious sleeping quarters. The Washington boys were stuck in the same rickety old building as the year before, with its leaky roof and cold river water showers. This year, they'd brought their own drinking water all the way from Washington, but the sleeping arrangements were even worse than last time. They had to bunk 9 to a room instead of 6. As many as 100,000 people had been expected for the regatta, but by mid-afternoon only perhaps a third of that number had showed up. It was a miserably wet, blustery day, with rain slanting down out of dark skies and torrents. Fewer than 100 sailboats, houseboats, and yachts had made their way to the finish line, where they lay swaying and bobbing at anchor. As race time approached, dark masses of people, huddled under umbrellas, made their way down the steep descent from Main Street to the water. The observation train began to fill up, though this year the open-sided cars were not as popular as the enclosed coaches. A little before 4 p.m., in a driving rain, Tom Bull's freshmen paddled upriver and took their starting position, with Columbia on one side and California on the other. The starting gun fired, and the regatta was underway before anyone realized it. Fans along the shoreline peered through a curtain of rain, struggling to distinguish one boat from another. For 30 strokes, it was a race. Then with Don Hume at stroke, Big Gordy Adam in the middle of the boat, and the tenacious Johnny White up in seat number 2, all settling into their rhythms, the Washington freshmen began to pull ahead. They eased out in front of the others as if it took no effort at all. Coach Bowles became agitated, then excited, and then finally, by all accounts, hysterical, waving his soggy old good-luck fedora hat in the air. He believed his freshmen were an even better crew than the previous year's bunch, and they were proving him right. They slid across the line, defeating California by 4 lengths. The rain had slowed a bit by 5 p.m. when the junior varsity race was set to go off, but it was still windy and the water was still rough. As Joe paddled upriver toward the starting line, he, like his crewmates, had a lot to think about. Cal had not sent a JV boat to Poughkeepsie, but Navy had a strong crew. The greatest danger, though, lay in his own shell. The recent defeats had shaken his self-confidence. The other boys were doubting themselves, too. Everyone from Seattle to New York seemed to want to know what had happened to them since their victory in California. But neither Joe nor anybody else in the boat could begin to answer the question. As they sat at the starting line in the city of Seattle, rolling with the choppy waves, waiting for the crack of the starting gun, with rainwater running down their necks and backs and dripping from their noses, the question wasn't whether they were strong or skilled enough. The real question was whether they had the maturity and discipline to keep their minds in the boat. Could they focus? Or would their anger and fear and uncertainty unhinge them? When the gun sounded, they got away slowly and fell behind almost immediately. For half a mile it looked as if they might, in fact, disintegrate as a crew. Then something that had been missing for a long while slowly kicked in. Realizing that they were losing, their determination took over and began to conquer their despair. They began to pull in long, sweet strokes, rowing at a composed beat of 33 strokes per minute. By the end of the first mile, they had found their swing and surged into the lead, quickly passing Cornell, Navy, and Syracuse. For the rest of the race, the sophomores rode gregariously, a long, sleek line of perfection, finishing a comfortable 2 lengths ahead of Navy. A Seattle radio announcer was struck by how easy they had made it look. At the end of the race, he declared, the boys looked as if they could have kept on rowing right down the river all the way to New York City without breaking a sweat. In the press section of the observation train, Al Ulbrichsen watched silently. His freshmen had won, the junior varsity too. He now had a chance of doing what no coach had ever done, winning all 3 Poughkeepsie races in the 8 oared shells and coming home to Seattle with a clean shot at going to Berlin. Yet, he knew that Cal's varsity crew was very strong. After the loss in Oakland, Kai Ebright had switched up his varsity, moving 4 boys from the previous year's national championship crew back into his top boat. Ulbrichsen had to wonder if Cal's losing crew in Oakland had been a trick. Maybe Ebright had been saving his best boat for Poughkeepsie. As 6 o'clock and the start of the climactic race approached, the weather improved and the crowds grew. Nobody in town that day wanted to miss out on seeing what sort of crew Ulbrichsen had come up with. Everyone wanted to see the boat that was good enough to displace his talented sophomores. 7 crews paddled to the starting line in a ghostly light mist. California had drawn lane number 1, nearest the western bank of the river, where the current was least likely to affect a boat. Washington was right next door, in lane number 2. Navy, Syracuse, Cornell, Columbia, and Pennsylvania stretched out across the river in lanes 3 through 7. The referee called, "Ready, all?" One by one, the coxswains lowered their hands. The starting gun fired. All 7 boats lurched off the line together, rowing stroke for stroke. They remained tightly bunched up for 100 yards. Then, Washington slowly edged out to a slight lead of about 4 feet. In the stern, Bobby Mock told his crew to settle in. At a half-mile, Washington still had the lead, with Syracuse just behind them. Then, Navy. Cornell and California were trailing badly. Over the next half-mile, Washington expanded its lead over Syracuse, but Cornell slowly moved up on the outside. Cal still trailed the field. At a mile and a half, Washington was out in front by open water and stretching its lead. On the observation train, Cal's coach, Kai Ebright, was worried. He leaned forward, peering through a pair of binoculars, studying his boys. Washington fans on the train began hooting and hollering. Fans on the docks and yachts in Poughkeepsie began to cheer. Many of them wanted this crew to accomplish the historic feat and sweep the races, even if it was a Western crew that did it. As they crossed the 2.5-mile mark, Washington's lead began to shrink. Navy and Syracuse were fading, but California and Cornell were finally starting to move up, inch by inch. Like Ebright, Al Ulbrichsen was studying his boys intently through binoculars. He was still half a mile from doing what he desperately wanted to do, and he knew it. Bobby Mock was riding the stern of the Washington boat like a jockey, leaning forward into the rain, urging the boat on, screaming for them to take the stroke rate higher, then higher still. In the middle of the boat, Big Stub McMillan was taking huge, powerful, smooth strokes. Up front, Chuck Day was trying to keep the boat in perfect balance, stroke after stroke, even as Mock kept calling for more. But they were running out of steam, and California and Cornell just kept coming. At mile 3, Cornell nosed out in front, then Cal came up to match them. Slowly, agonizingly, Washington fell into third. Over the final mile, Cal and Cornell battled for the lead, but Washington fell 2 lengths behind. As the leaders crossed the line, both crews thought they'd won. Minutes later, the official results were announced. Kai Ebright in California had won their 3rd straight national varsity title by 1/3 of a second. And they'd done it in near record time, despite a stiff crosswind and heavy chop. The only boat ever to have turned in a faster time was Ebright's own Olympic gold medal crew of 1928. It looked more than ever as if California would be going to Berlin the following year. Chapter 17. Difficult and Dangerous Work. Joe's old car labored and coughed and wheezed, crawling up the long, steep ascent to Blue West Pass high in the Cascade Mountains. That morning in June of 1935, he had thrown his banjo and his clothes in the back seat, said goodbye to Joyce for the summer, and driven out of Seattle, heading east looking for work. Jobs were still scarce, but there was hope for Joe. The previous summer, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had traveled out to Washington to a town near the Columbia River in a 50-mile-long dry canyon called the Grand Coulee. 20,000 people gathered to hear him speak, among them George Pocock and his family. When President Roosevelt appeared on the platform before them, the crowd roared its welcome, and when he spoke of plans to build a massive new dam in that rough, empty country, they cheered again. The Grand Coulee Dam, he said, would bring water to arid farmland, generate electrical power, and create thousands of jobs. Now, less than a year after Roosevelt's speech, Joe drove down from the mountains, through gently rolling jade-green wheat fields into the rugged Washington scablands, then on to the ramshackle boomtown of Grand Coulee, perched just above the Columbia River. 30 minutes after he stepped out of his car, he had a job. To build the foundation of the dam, hundreds of workers first had to knock away layers of loose rock from the canyon walls to get to the older granite bedrock. Then the granite itself had to be shaped. The men who performed this work had to strap themselves into harnesses, dangle from the cliff face hundreds of feet above the river, and pound away at the rock with jackhammers. The work was difficult and dangerous, but it paid better than the other jobs at the dam. Joe signed himself up for 75 cents an hour. That evening, before his first day of work, he sat on the hood of his car in front of the office. Down in the coulee, steam shovels and electric shovels clawed at piles of loose rock. Bulldozers pushed earth and rocks from one place to another. Tractors crawled back and forth, gouging out terraces. On the cliffs, men suspended from ropes crawled and swung from one spot to another like so many black spiders. Studying them, Joe saw that they were drilling holes in the rock faces with jackhammers. As he watched, a long, shrill whistle blew, and the jackhammer men scrambled quickly to the top of their lines. At the base of the cliffs, hundreds of men who'd been loosening the fallen rock with picks and crowbars suddenly scurried away. The deep, hollow, concussive sound of an explosion boomed and blossomed across the canyon. A shower of rocks and boulders tumbled down onto the piles below. Joe was not at all sure what he was getting into here, but he was flat broke again and more than a little discouraged. Not just about money, but about the whole crew business. Demoted and demoted again, he'd started to think of himself as a kind of yo-yo in the hands of the coaches, and yet the notion of Olympic gold had begun to work its way into his brain. A medal would be real and solid. It would be forever. Something nobody could deny or take away. He wanted that gold medal now, and it surprised him how much it had begun to mean to him. He figured it had something to do with Thula, or with his father. Certainly it had something to do with Joyce. He felt more and more that he had to get to Berlin to prove something to himself and to his family. To do that, he had to make the first varsity boat, and to do that, he had to pay for another year of school. That meant strapping on a harness, grabbing a jackhammer, and lowering himself over the edge of a cliff in the morning. The jackhammer work was brutal. For 8 hours a day, he dangled on a rope in the furnace-like heat of the canyon, pounding at the wall of rock in front of him. The jackhammer was heavy and seemed to have a life of its own, constantly trying to rip itself out of his grip. Rock, dust, gritty and irritating, swirled around him. It got in his eyes, his mouth, and his nose. Sharp chips and shards of rock flew up and stung his face. Sweat dripped from his back and fell away into the void below. He learned to cooperate closely with the men dangling on either side of him. They worked together, keeping an eye out for rocks falling from above, dodging them when they could, calling out warnings to those below, searching for better places to find seams in the rock. By the end of each day he was exhausted, parched with thirst, and ravenously hungry. 3 times a day he ate in the mess hall, sitting shoulder to shoulder with men at long tables. He ate as he had back in his boyhood, at the gold and ruby mine, tucking into mountains of food, eggs, pancakes, bacon, and sausage at breakfast, then sandwiches and ice cream for lunch, finally a huge meal of red meat or chicken at dinner, topped off with slabs of pie. Joe never left a scrap on his plate or anyone else's within reach. Each night he climbed up the hill to a place called Shacktown, where he had found a cheap room to rent in a long, rickety, shed-like building. The building had no indoor plumbing and only enough electricity to supply one bare light bulb that hung overhead. Each of the gravel streets in Shacktown had a shower house, but Joe soon found that taking a shower was not a comfortable experience. Hordes of black widow spiders lurked in the rafters above the showers, and they tended to drop on them and below as soon as the water was turned on. After watching a few of his neighbors leap out of the shower yelping and batting at themselves, Joe finally took to carrying a broom into the shower each evening to clear the rafters of 8-legged invaders before he turned the water on. For the first couple of weeks, Joe kept mostly to himself after work and dinner, sitting in the dark playing his banjo. Then he discovered that there were 2 boys from the Washington shell house working at the dam as well. He didn't know either of them very well, but that was about to change. Johnny White had sat in the number 2 seat in Coach Bull's outstanding freshman boat. He was an inch shorter than Joe and more slightly built, with all-American good looks. He was also nearly as poor as Joe Rance. He graduated from high school at 16, then spent the next 2 years working in a shipyard and a sawmill, saving cash and building brawn. Now he had arrived at Grand Coulee looking to make more money and build more muscle. The other Washington boy at Grand Coulee was Chuck Day. He was pure muscle, broad in the shoulders, and his eyes could be cheerful one moment, flashing with rage the next. He wore glasses, but managed to look tough doing it, and despite Ulbrichtsen's rules, he had almost always had a cigarette dangling from his lip. The previous year he had rowed in Bobby Mock's boat. He and Joe had hardly ever exchanged 2 words, at least not civil words. Now, though, the 3 boys fell into an easy and comfortable friendship. Without a word, they put aside the rivalries of the shell house, forgot about the insults. After their long, crushingly hard work weeks, they gathered on Saturday afternoons to escape the heat and watch movies at the Grand Coulee Theater. At night, they wandered B Street, a 3-block stretch of dirt and gravel lined on either side with card rooms and bars and pool halls and flea-bag hotels and a Chinese restaurant, the Woo Dip Kitchen. Jazz and country music poured out of the bars and dance halls. The boys took it all in with wide eyes. None of them had ever seen anything quite like it, and they weren't sure how to behave in this new world. They remembered Al Ulbrichtsen's rules: no smoking, no drinking, no cussing. But there were many temptations. They drank some beer and played some pool and sang along with ragtag cowboy bands late into the night. When they wanted to escape the noise of B Street, the boys sometimes traveled down the Coulee to swim in Soap Lake. For the most part, though, they stayed in Grand Coulee, where they could toss a football around, hurl rocks at the edges of the cliffs, or sit around a campfire at night telling ghost stories as coyotes yelped in the distance. They were happy, free, and easy, cut loose in the wide expanse of the western desert, ignoring for now the contest that they all knew lay ahead the following year.